Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. This episode of Victor's Children is about the politics of transgender oppression and liberation, and I'm very happy to be speaking with Jules Joanne Gleason, co-editor of the book Transgender Marxism. So could you just introduce yourself to listeners, Jules?
Hi, it's so nice to join you. I'm a writer and an editor and a comedian based currently in Vienna in Austria, but originally I'm from London and I've lived various other places over the past 10 years. So yeah, well, that's the basics. Anything more specific you want to?
No, that's great. I should have thought. I didn't think about asking you about the comedian side of what you do, but we'll see. Maybe we'll start by talking a bit about gender. And so, could you start us off with some thoughts about how you think we should understand gender from a broadly historical materialist perspective?
Yeah, so gender is an interesting one because I feel like increasingly gender is becoming something which is controversial to even name, or something which is increasingly controversial to even talk about. So when we're going to try and talk about it from a historical materialist point of view, I think one of the things that's helpful to do is kind of identify two different origin points, which, like, of late, these two different origin points have kind of been treated in various different ways by different people. So the first one is sort of like the mid-20th century, like sexological account of gender, which comes primarily out of the corpus of one guy, a New Zealander actually, based in Johns Hopkins University in the US. So that's John Money. And John Money was kind of using this term gender. In fact, the full formulation he was using was gender identity and role, or slash role, as kind of one way of trying to work out how to sort and how to categorize all of his patients. So this was like one of the origin points of gender, a pretty like, well, it was part of like an overall system, which I can't really get into, but John Money had this vision of things where there were like 7 ways of determining how he could sort out his patients. And the first 6 were kind of more physiological things. And then the final 7th was this gender identity or role. So this is like the kind of sexological view, and that's increasingly come back into scrutiny recently with works like recently Jill Peterson, the other Jules of gender theory, or maybe I'm the other one, I don't know. Well, anyway, she's got this book, Histories of the Transgender Child, and Gayle Peterson's kind of like looking at this origin point of the term, and ultimately kind of comes to the conclusion that the term gender and like that whole framework is one which is like thoroughly contaminated and thoroughly like imbricated, let's say, with that kind of historical baggage. But rather confusingly, there is then a second understanding of gender, and this kind of, roughly speaking, originates between 1975 and 1990. So 1975 is when one lesbian feminist, Gayle Rubin, in her capacity as a scholar of anthropology and sexuality, comes out with an essay entitled "The Traffic in Women: Notes on the Political Economy of Sex." Political economy has kind of quote marks in this title. And Gayle Rubin is the one who kind of makes this sex-gender distinction, which we're familiar with. And I'm not going to go into how and why she does that in any great detail, but basically, long story short, she's like a scholar of kinship, or she's theorizing the question of kinship, which is sort of following on from structuralist like scholars like Claude Lévi-Strauss and others. And so basically, she's trying to provide this critical account of kinship, like from a feminist point of view. So this is like the secondary understanding of gender, which, like I say, the one originally from sexology was sort of like a a rather different, a rather kind of more clinically oriented account. Whereas this view of gender is more about like sociology, anthropological theory, that kind of stuff. So most famously, this sex gender account then gets sort of like cast into question in the 1990s with Judith Butler's work. One thing to say about Judith Butler and Gayle Rubin is they're both lesbian feminists. They're both from different wings of the lesbian feminist movement. Originally, Judith Butler is a radical feminist, and Gayle Rubin is one of the she's like one of the sadomasochistic Ludditics, which is a thing she writes about quite openly and publishes about throughout the 1980s. But at 1990, this kind of switches around because Judith Butler sort of turncoats their way into being associated with queer feminism with this work, Gender Trouble. And Gender Trouble's main thing is tackling this question of sex and gender. And basically, Butler is not satisfied with any kind of like easy or like explanatory distinction between sex and gender. So this is kind of where we got like the start of Butlerian gender theory. So basically what I'm trying to outline here is there's two pretty radically different viewpoints right from the start. And one comes out of clinical practice. It comes out of both, well, I guess it comes out of the medicalizing part of the academy, right? So it comes out of powerful research institutions, but these are like kind of psychiatric through to endocrinological, like medicalizing bodies. And then there's this second understanding, which is more like anthropology, sociology kind of thing. So it's sort of like John Money and Gayle Rubin through to Judith Butler. Those are like the two two overarching kind of understandings, which I think most people will kind of end up talking in one or the other of those two terms, or they'll end up talking about one or other definition of gender. And it's quite interesting because sort of right from the start, we're sort of left with this situation where like at this point, even using the term gender becomes incredibly contentious. And it's especially contentious because like the term itself, like the term gender, is now a sort of rallying point for much of the right wing. And that's something which is true around the world. That's something which is true in France with opposition to gay marriage. It's something which is true in Brazil, where like evangelical Christians and nationalist forces have kind of merged into each other. It's true in all kinds of places. It's definitely true in Eastern Europe, where especially the Catholic Church and the conventions of bishops throughout Eastern Europe, especially starting with Poland, have specifically like started to target gender ideology. So when the right wing are kind of like, when the right wing are kind of complaining and like protesting about us even talking about things in terms of gender, it's sort of like the first thing I guess we should ask is like which gender do they mean? Like what is the understanding which they find the most reprehensible? And maybe that's something we can discuss. I don't know. That's something which like I just want to open up as a concern. So anyway, having done that kind of like genealogy, I suppose, it kind of falls to me to say like, well, like, is this a term which we should be using at all? And I guess my answer is kind of provisionally yes, because I think it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting the potency it exactly has. Specifically, like, yeah, the potency as in like, if something is like so irritating and so intolerable to the far right that they don't even want us to talk about it, we have to identify like what is it which they don't want to be discussed. So maybe let's move on a bit. I feel like that's enough of a entry point.
And it's certainly helpful, I think, the way you've described those different kind of streams of thought, which of course emerged completely outside of historical materialism, right? And so it's interesting to think about what people, in the Marxist tradition of one way or the other, how we come to relate to this concept. But maybe we could move on then, yeah. And the next thing I wanted to ask you about is really the transformative impact of capitalism, since there's been gender oppression in different forms long before capitalism. But what do you see as the most important ways that the development of and spread of capitalism has changed gender relations as a shorthand?
Yeah, that's really this is a question which sort of takes me takes me into my historical background. So for those who don't know my work, I'm mostly trained as a historian. I'm mostly actually trained as a pre-modern historian. So my academic background, such as it is focused mostly around Byzantine history and other kind of pre-modern gender formations, and sort of like taking comparative approaches to those. So clearly, clearly capitalism didn't birth gender depression or household patriarchy or whatever easily problematized term we want to use to address that, right? So clearly there were, to use the language I would use, clearly there were patriarchal relations which underpinned modes of production prior to capitalism. So before we had our current setup of impersonal domination of capital and exploitation and extraction of abstract labor, we still nevertheless had other means of like gender oppression and other ways that gender relations were kind of integrated into the extraction of other surpluses. So when I talk about like surpluses, I should probably just give a sketch of what I mean for people who don't really have any grounding in pre-modern political economy. So so when I'm talking about surpluses prior to capitalism, we mostly kind of have in mind, well, from the context we have written sources about at least, we mostly have in mind kind of agrarian labor. So year in, year out, we would have communities of agrarian laborers who would be expected to yield up their surpluses for basically for rendering, usually into a kind of coinage, a coinage of one kind or another, which would then be collected by some kind of central authority. So obviously this is a very schematic and broad stroke opinion. So what a coin would look like, what kind of structures were there, and what kind of authorities were like overseeing this process varied pretty wildly throughout the millennia. But nevertheless, you had kind of like an intergenerational procession of this kind of like continual extraction, which across a broad range of contexts would normally happen on some kind of annual or seasonal kind of basis. So there'd be a regular like interplay of some kind of central core and then like broader sort of provincial allotments, I suppose, of basically populations that were divided first and foremost into the surplus yield which they were able to generate. So this is like something which was fixed in place, and that's something which is exactly what allowed so many of these political formations to exist for centuries or millennia in one form or another. So what are the ways that the development and spread of capitalism changed gender? Well, very manifold, and indeed, like it's quite difficult to it's even quite difficult to like begin to describe the different ways which this was kind of like a transformative moment for what we now call gender relations.
I think you did a great job of just summarizing a complex history, in terms of tax collectors and people extracting tribute and so on from peasants in different ways, and those people were engaged in agriculture, and all that production was very much organized around the household, right? But of course, the development of capitalism, which of course could itself be an entire episode, a whole series of episodes. But if we assume that the development of capitalism, I would argue, really first takes off, and the new mode of production becomes dominant in England for the first time, you get the separation of production from the household in a new way, right? There's a capitalism transforms households, and that this has an important impact on gender relations.
I suppose the part which sort of provides a lot of curiosity and a lot of ongoing theoretical consternation and also political struggle is that effectively what happens under capitalist systems is you have these tasks, and you have these bits of labor which need to be done in a fairly routinized fashion, or at least a way which is reliable across time. So you need like workplaces and workforces and designated training and stuff like that. But the way that that reshapes things is that there's this kind of like ongoing question about the interchangeability of these laboring units, right? It's like a specific workforce is clearly needed for particular tasks, like across time. And but on the other hand, there's this kind of interchangeability where because the way these workforces are being formalized or like routinized is people are kind of bringing their labor to market. They're showing up to try and sell their labor as proletarians. There is this aspect where like a lot of the time, specific measures have to be taken if you want any other outcome besides like an intermixing and an intermingling of the people providing it. So when I'm talking about like measures needing to be taken, we could consider, for example, the British civil service, which had very specific rules to do with the kind of roles which women were allowed to play within it. Or another example would be specialized training. So for instance, for a time you had women being allowed to attend universities, even being allowed to attend medical schools, with the proviso that they couldn't actually graduate as doctors or even bachelors or masters from these institutions. So you have like specific juridical measures put in place which try and kind of like delimit which particular types of laborer get to end up in particular workforces, or to attempt that anyway. So another obvious example where this appears, and this gets us into an even more complex question, is systems of racialization and citizenship. So what you see in pretty much any racializing system is that one of the things it tries to impact on is specific tasks and specific roles being allocated to specific either citizenship categories or to like racialized ones. So you can see this obviously the Deep South or South Africa prior to the end of apartheid are the examples which people tend to talk about. But there are other examples which are kind of like ongoing, like for instance in Malaysia, you have specific racial categories or specific religious categories with the two overlapping as to who's even allowed to attend a university in many instances. So you can see all kinds of these different like specific like privileging insofar as they're providing like private laws and institutionalized perks and so on for different groups along both gender and race/citizenship. So what I'm trying to say here is like specifically you get these institutional fixes to try and like segregate up the otherwise kind of like congealing and interchangeable nature of labor power, right?
Yeah, and so there's obviously a lot of change that happens, and I think it's worth mentioning this here just because I think a lot of people who are concerned about the politics of the present may not kind of fully appreciate just how dramatically gender relations have been transformed through these long periods of history. And of course, given your research on Byzantium and so on, I guess this is stuff that would be obvious to you, but not, most people don't have much knowledge of that pre-modern era. So
there's actually a bit of chaos going on in the field of Byzantine studies around gender and intersectionality right now, which I'm not going to go into. But there was this recent book called called Byzantine Intersectionality by a scholar called Roland Betancourt, who's a kind of U.S. queer theory informed art historian. And I've written a review of this book, but I'm not really going to go into the whole controversy. But as I say, at this point, like even mentioning gender, it has this expletive quality which lots of people just can't abide and can't tolerate. And that's I think that's just kind of like one example of it. But like I say, I'll try and avoid getting into the thickets of that one. However, yeah, right. So let's get back to your original question. So like we're in the midst of a huge like shift or transformational moment, right? That's what you're saying.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's precisely that we should focus on now. I like to think about it in terms of cracks in the walls of the supremacist heteropatriarchal gender order. And it's one of the things that I think is very hopeful in the world today. But so what do you think is actually going on? Obviously, this is a huge question, but in terms of what's happening in terms of gender relations that's underpinning, for example, as you mentioned, the Catholic Church and elements of the far right with their, we could say, crusade against what they call gender theory, and all the political changes that are happening on this terrain of gender. Could you share some of your thoughts on this moment that we're in now?
Yeah, of course. So, so what you're kind of seeing is, I usually use the word like denaturalization. That's the overarching thing that's going on, I think. What you're seeing is like a denaturalization of all kinds of previously expected or conventionally kind of understood gender divides. And in a way, I feel like the right wing, like you mentioned, the Catholic Church or neo-fascist organizations, who are often kind of putting this at the forefront. Like one of these groups is called the Proud Boys. You know what I mean? They're like not making any secret of their sort of gender reaffirming aspects, right? So what these kind of right-wing groups are like intuitively sensing, or in a kind of post hoc way trying to react to, is this sort of like overall, when I say it's a denaturalization, what I mean is specifically people are having to argue for all kinds of things which they were not anticipating having to prepare arguments for. And why this is happening is very complex, but it's complex and also, I think, quite self-perpetuating. So I kind of describe this like unfolding debate within lesbian feminism between like the mid 70s and the early 90s, which we're still kind of living in the wake of. And what I think is so striking about it is previously there was this sense, especially that even if we were like dealing with questions like minority groups, sexual minority groups like lesbians or gay men or trans people kind of pursuing civic emancipation, there was a sense that ultimately this was a question of humane treatment or perhaps recognition or something like that, but that we would always kind of be comfortably, we would always have a situation where this would be a kind of comfortable minority sort of a thing. But as generations continue to turn, it seems to be much less markedly the case. Like when you see surveys of like sexual identification across time, especially among like today's teenagers and people in their 20s, we're seeing a real kind of collapse of like standard heterosexuality, or like a collapse of people that really are going to identify that way, which I think is like not something we can assume is going to continuously proceed across time. But nevertheless, it sort of left us in this situation where like ways of life and approaches to living and kind of like also communities and groups, which previously were kind of much more comfortably possible to think about as this subcultural fringe of humanity, at this point have both numerically expanded, like obviously proportionally expanded by any measurement, which we seem to be able to do, but also kind of have lost a lot of the sense of like needing to justify themselves, or sort of like well, how can I put this? For instance, I think it's like no, actually I'm kind of, I guess I was just thinking about gay marriage, but that's like, well, to me it's like, it's interesting that simultaneously like with gay marriage, for instance, this was like a preoccupying political issue. This was one of the main kind of culture war issues which George Bush and his Republican Party were mobilizing in the 2000s, through to kind of these furious street protests in France, which I think if your listeners are not aware of them, I'm sure many of them will be, check out the scale and the intensity of the protests led by the religious right in France around gay marriage, and also the measures which Eastern European states took throughout the 2010s to often like constitutionally amend out the possibility of homosexual marriage. So this is kind of like this ongoing sort of rolling struggle. But what's striking to me is it went from this like this preoccupying political issue to something which is now kind of legalized in every single state. And even one of these books by a gender critical feminist in Britain, even in the acknowledgements, she's saying, oh, well, thanks to my wife who picked me up off the floor and stuff like this. So we have a kind of like unabashed normalization within within even the not exceptionally progressive parts of lesbian and gay life, that this is now just something which is kind of taken for granted. It's like, okay, well, you can just introduce someone as your wife even though you're a woman. So this is like one of the breakthroughs. I think it's like not, again, with the thing with well, the reason I was cautious about bringing up gay marriage as an example is obviously that this is how relevant marriage is to you has a large amount to do with your class position and exactly like how much wealth it's worth bothering about like your children getting hold of, you know what I mean? That's a very heavily class condition question, which is exactly why it became such a central and primary issue for a time. But yeah, so overall, I think you're definitely right that there is this transformative, like denaturalizing moment underway. And I agree that it's like a very hopeful thing, but it's also very unpredictable. I think that like there's a real shortage of accounts of why this is happening. And I don't even think that I'm able to provide I'm able to provide some pointers, but I don't think I'm able to provide a comprehensive explanation of why this might be, especially not why it's happening now. But yeah, we can keep on talking about it. I guess that's that's what I got to say.
I think denaturalization is a fantastic, brief way to name this process that we're living through. And you've obviously touched on some very important political aspects of it here. And I guess we can think about this as conditions in which we've seen the rise of an unprecedented advocacy and then also mobilization and organizing for equality rights for trans people. Certainly, it's often been fought out around human rights legislation and who's included in terms of protected categories of people, along with pressure for cultural acceptance and access to non-oppressive healthcare and other services for trans folks. But so this is going to be familiar to most, I'm sure, really all listeners. But trans liberation politics go beyond the politics of equal rights, which are the most influential today on the left and in certain parts of liberalism. So could you just sketch out as clear as you can, maybe starkly as you can, the difference between the politics of trans liberation and the politics of equal rights or recognition that you were flagging earlier, and why we need a politics that's a politics of liberation here?
Yeah, so one place to start with this is this 2015 essay by Nat Raha, who also has a book in the, she also has a chapter in the book. And what Raha's kind of saying in this essay, I think it's called The Limits of Transliberalism. It's up on the Verso blog, so your readers can go and see it. She talks about this moment where Juliet Jacks, who's actually a trans memoirist and a comrade, who's she's helped us promote this book, so I'm a fan. She describes in her memoir this moment where she is offered a meeting with this name is escaping me now, which is bizarre. Theresa May. She's offered a meeting with Theresa May, who is at this point the Home Secretary. She's later the Prime Minister. And as the Home Secretary of Britain, Theresa May was kind of fronting this drive to kind of get rid of the migrants that were there and close off the borders for further migration. And she did this in ways including like sending menacing trucks around East London, because East London has a very large first generation migrant community, kind of threats telling them they should get out of the country and stuff like that if they were illegal migrants. And so basically Theresa May was involved in this, and Juliet Jacks kind of describes her moment of crisis, really a moment of judgment, where she's kind of like, she's kind of left with, on the one hand, this sense that if you meet and ingratiate these powerful people and they've seen you face to face and you've pumped hands and made small talk, that this is like advantageous. And on the other hand, the kind of horrific nativist violence which this this particular politician was kind of like doing to the fabric of Britain, and especially to the racialized minorities of Britain. So so what Nat's essay is kind of trying to get at is that this is like a reoccurring this is like the defining question for a certain sort of liberal lefty kind of like trans political advocacy position, right? It's that to an extent the state is willing to do meet and greets and incorporate you, basically bring your body bring your body into that process. But on the other hand, this always comes with this comes at a price, right? There's like a legitimation which you're being expected to do to this whole theater, and needless to say, the trans people who are being included are not the homeless for the most part. They're not the racialized minorities. They are they're the trans people who are sort of presentable. So this is like the issue of transliberalism, which Nat, I think, very skillfully sketches out for us. And it's also like, well, what's sad about the intervening years in the case of Britain is exactly that transliberalism has kind of experienced this downfall, this very obvious like failure as one kind of liberal institution after another, from the Guardian newspaper to the BBC to the what are they called? EHRC, not the EHRC, the equalities bodies, and so on. One of them after another seem to have like devolved into this kind of foundationalist anti-trans feminism. So basically, this how much of a problem, or how much transliberalism is the problem for trans politics, really seems to vary a lot across national contexts. So if you're looking at the United States, I'd be interested to hear the situation in Canada. I don't know how much you know about the relative situation there. Definitely in the United States, like the Democratic Party has put like serious resources, like serious muscle into going through with this co-option. And in a way which I wasn't quite expecting, as someone who used to like watch US politics very closely in the 2000s, to a degree I wasn't anticipating this kind of like pro-trans stuff has been wrapped up in the kind of partisan polarization. So Democrats versus Republicans. So like Republicans hate trans people because Republicans don't believe in science. That's the kind of Democratic Party line at the moment, which requires, a view of transition which reduces it down to neurochemical imbalances or developmental quirks or whatever. So long story short, transliberalism is kind of booming in the United States for the exact same reason that it's busting in Britain. And right, so what can we do to sort of get beyond that? Well, basically the Marxist account of what is wrong with transliberalism is the same as the usual Marxist account to do with liberalism, which is that what capitalist liberation looks like, what freedom looks like in a capitalist context, is the equal rights to sleep under a bridge. So a wealthy person can go camping, and an Irish proletarian in the early 20th century is forced to move from place to place, searching for work and building the motorways of England. That's the freedom that you get under capitalism. And this is just as true for questions of transition as anything else. With the point that specifically what transliberalism is attempting to do is like it's basically trying to frame it's basically trying to say that like an ordinary life is possible for trans people. And the best rejoinder we can offer is like, well, yeah, but an ordinary life is reconciling yourself with overarching systems of exploitation in one way or another. And I definitely don't think that suffices. I don't see any reason I don't see any reason that would suffice anymore with this set of questions than any other one, right? So that's sort of where I'm coming from, and that's what seems pretty clear to me. But as I say, this is one of those things where it how pressing this is a concern is very much to do with the local, like national climate, and how amenable the local liberal parties and establishment are towards like this kind of recognition and this kind of like extension of civic rights. Okay, actually, I have one more thing to say. Sorry, I've already gone on for a while. And one thing to say is actually about the EU. So one of the stories to talk about here is Ireland. So like in Ireland, the on paper rights which trans people enjoy are pretty remarkable. So there's self-identification that has been for quite some years now. If you want to trans your gender, you make a sworn statement, which is like signed by a notary, and then that's all you have to do. So there's all of these like on paper, like remarkable provisioning. And yet the actual like lived reality of the Irish trans people I talk to is defined both by this like intractable healthcare breakdown, and then also just like a prevailing hostility, which I don't want to oversimplify it, but like they don't report like they don't report that these on paper things kind of amount to like a widespread kind of like cultural acceptance of their positions. And there's also obviously part of Ireland is being occupied by the British state of late, and in the occupied parts of Ireland, you have you have trans life being defined by the same kind of sectarian divisions. You have like parallel development of different trans communities across the nationalist and unionist communities there. So right. So anyway, long story short, it doesn't really like civic emancipation in the event. It doesn't really seem to like amount to the actual kind of like meaningful change that I want to see. And for that reason, I think like with the book and so on, we've had a fair amount of interest and a fair amount of dialogue with Irish socialists, communists, ecologists, anarchists, and so on, who are like, I guess it's like it's an obvious like case in point, I guess I'd say.
Maybe just picking up on this, so contrasting the civic emancipation, equal rights with trans liberation, what would you identify as being the key sort of social material changes that would need to be won in order to actually lay the basis for liberation? Do you think about like what are the foundations there that we would want to pinpoint?
I think that the key issues are like in a way the most remarkably basic things you can think of, like how could you possibly have an emancipatory outcome when the labor markets are still largely being controlled by private individuals and their like decisive prejudices? Like one of the major issues, if we're talking about like the proletarianization of trans people, so I'm saying proletarianization as in like people not having control over their workplaces or control over the way they spend their time and their lives for that reason. Well, I guess with unemployment of trans people, this is like a thing which is pretty persistently true. Actually, across national contexts, there's like a huge chunk of trans people just unable to find consistent work, especially consistent work which is not outlawed. So like, and a lot of the reason is there have been like consistent surveys of employers and their attitudes, and there's simply this like widespread not only reluctance but straight out refusal to accept hiring a trans person. And that's something which I've seen studies on that from various different contexts, and it seems like as much as broader social attitudes are changing, and as much variation as there is on this point, it is very inconsistent industry from industry is what I mean now. As much as broader social changes are underway, actually reforming the attitudes of the actual bourgeoisie is a much more gradual process, let's say. And for that reason, there's widespread inability of trans people to work. So you get kind of this question where it's like, well, what would an end to that look like? And well, I know what my end to that would look like, but I think you can see how like this is one of those instances where it's like this is one issue which you kind of like you only have you sort of only have two options, and one is like gradual cultural transformation and hoping for the best and hoping that every capitalist industry gradually transforms to look like the tech employers of Silicon Valley, which to me seems quite unlikely, or some kind of shift towards worker control. So yeah, that's I mean, maybe there are other options I'm not thinking of. You tell me.
Well, I think that's really worth mentioning because of the way, especially that the workplace has become, in a sense, marginal to the way a lot of radical politics thinks about politics. So I think just naming that is really important, since, for various reasons, I think there's been a retreat from the workplace as a focus for radical radical politics, certainly in the part of the world where I live. But then I guess there's just also also the questions about bodily autonomy and self-determination, and what kinds of conditions we would need to create in order to make that something that's as real for people in their everyday lives that it brings up. So I think if we could move on, I want to bring up the question about the implication of transliberation for cis people, in short, so people who are living in the same gender that they were assigned at birth. And I think there are some cis people on the left who say that they support transliberation, but really think it's fundamentally an issue for trans people. However, the kind of socialism from below politics that I support sees all liberation struggles against particular forms of oppression, as having universal implications. On the one hand, they directly affect working class people who are part of dominant groups and anybody else who's committed to going beyond capitalism. So in this case, working class cis people. But these politics of liberation also contribute to the project of human emancipation more broadly. So in the case of transliberation, I think it has implications for cis working class people that go beyond our responsibility to combat the oppression of trans people and to support trans comrades' self-organization and struggles. And I think transliberation contributes to the politics of universal human emancipation. So I'm interested, is that similar to how you see things? And what do you see as the universal implications of the effort to, if you like, abolish cis supremacy?
That's really a remarkable question, or set of questions. So you were saying, yeah, you see this universal emancipation. You said human emancipation, kind of being hatched out of the liberation of this particular group. Well, that's definitely what I think. So, I believe that there are simultaneously, the emancipation is universal, but also in a sense the struggle is kind of universal. And when I say the struggle here, I mean not just class war, although that's very important, but also the struggle to kind of work out a workable form of life, a workable thing to call yourself, or way to move through the world. These are all things which everyone is having to cope with in their own ways. And I guess to speak about myself for a moment, I don't really consider anything I'm saying primarily like an extension of my own what they call your lived experience. I think what's interesting to me is often like dead experience, and dead labor as well. I think that really what I would like to do, and what I think the people I'm in dialogue with are trying to do, is kind of provide this account of what on earth it is that happens between the mid 19th century to like the mid 20th, where like suddenly all of these features of the human physique and of development, or whatever else you want to call it, all of these features start to be kind of like recognized in a new light. There's this real sequence of technological breakthroughs which extends roughly from the discovery of like stress hormones, so the vivisection of animals, like to remove their adrenal glands, which French physiologists were doing in the late 19th century, through to the very rapid and sequential discovery of the major bodily hormones between like the 1910s and the early 1950s. I think melatonin was like the last major one, which we got in 1952. But yeah, you get this very rapid technological set of breakthroughs, which sort of leave our understanding of human physiology and all of this kind of reeling, and still in a way are something we're trying to resolve. Because what this opens up is that there's this mutability of our physiology, of also our anatomy, and the interplay of those two things. And that's kind of what we start to deal with. So there are some really widely understood examples of that. So obviously one is birth control. So this was one of the major kind of technological interlocking concerns of the civil rights movement back in the mid 20th century. Mid to late 20th century, let's say. And so there are a huge range of different breakthroughs and sort of ongoing struggles, which like all of us are just having to make sense of and cope with. And and that's something which it needs to be said, like that's something which places particular burdens or particular opportunities even for specific minority groups, and in many cases actually directs and sort of like causes a lot of the harm which people are going through. So a lot of my like political activity in recent years has been intersex activism. So this is one of the things I've kind of been concerning myself with. And obviously intersex people are one of these groups which it's hard to say that this like endocrine revolution or this kind of like hormonal understanding breakthrough, it's hard to say that this set of breakthroughs actually had positive outcomes for intersex people, because exactly the refined understanding was then used as a set of justifications for a lot of the medicalized violence which intersex people have been encountering, which only kind of intensified around the mid-20th century. In fact, it became much more routinized with the industrialization of childbirth, which was occurring around that time. So what I'm trying to say is that specific minority groups and specific sections of the population are at once being given like socially mandated burdens and even violence on a routinized level as this process is unfolding, but equally opportunities and like prospects for emancipation are appearing. But none of this really seems to happen. None of this happens without conflict, which is very much run through the division of labor. So if you're a trans person who has identified your dysphoria and realizes that this dysphoria is connected with potentially fatal mental health problems you've been experiencing for much of your life, if you realize this, then you still have another struggle to go through. Like this recognition is something which then needs to be, if you want to do things legally, you have to provide an account of yourself to various medical professionals. So here in Austria, it would be 4 medical professionals. You have to have 3 mental health professionals and then 1 endocrinologist who can prescribe you the drugs. So that's the kind of thing that I mean. So these basically these like technological, biochemical, physiological breakthroughs of understanding then sort of just ground us in struggles which are unabashedly social or institutional in their character. So so this stuff which I'm saying, it shouldn't be seen as like, it should definitely not be seen as like me outlining what we're going to do or what you need to support us doing. It's more like, I'm more like trying to sketch out a set of problems which all of us are kind of plunged into, and each of us are just trying to make sense of the best we can. When I say us there, I mean like any human being, actually. Human being of whatever class position, really. But yeah, so that kind of sets us up to like, my contention, my commitment is that I think with all that said, this is a universal human problem, or a set of universal human problems which each of us confronts. But we we ultimately can't just get out of it as humans. We sort of, there has to be like class struggle of one kind or another, whether that's showing up with an advocate to a doctor, or campaigning at a hospital to stop the surgeries against intersex infants born there, which is something which has been done very successfully in Chicago recently. That's what it looks like. Like the struggle is what moves us out of the human and into something a bit more particular.
Thank you. And I guess I would just pick up on your earlier point where you named denaturalization, and just say that I think that there's a way in which all liberation struggles have a very strong denaturalizing impulse, because of the way that oppression is so generally naturalized by the oppressors. And so the calling into question of gender in a much more profound way that, obviously this is something which feminism has brought to the left more broadly, but I think that transliberation politics just changes and builds on that in a way which has significant implications for everybody in quite a progressive and positive way.
I guess one thing with feminism is that simultaneously, I don't think transliberation can be reduced to it. Like less and less am I convinced that it's helpful to talk about trans feminism. That's not something I'm really minded to develop myself. No shade on people who are, but I don't see that term as very useful these days. So I don't think trans liberation can be like reduced to like an adjunct or like a variation on feminism. However, it's like inarguable that a lot of the stuff we're discussing and a lot of the breakthroughs and a lot of the social conflicts which we're currently engaged with would have been very difficult to conceive of without, let's say, feminism and the women's movement, very loosely defined. Which has been an ongoing thing since, again, longer than the late 19th century, but very visibly since then. So a lot of but I can't really go into it, but a lot of the differentiation which makes this stuff so easily naturalized is what has been kind of shaken and cast into doubt by the women's movement. And that is kind of this ongoing conundrum, I think, for trans liberation, that how is it that some of the fiercest transphobic, or let's say detractors of trans liberation come from the exact movement which made it possible. This is a big conundrum which I'm happy to like chat about more another time, but I think that's like an ongoing set of questions I've got. And I especially find it striking how a lot of like the cutting edge of social theory are sort of like shying away from talking about feminism, talking about gender. So this is Jules Gleason is one example which I mentioned earlier, but there's also like, say, Andrea Long Chu's book Females, Sophie Lewis's book Full Surrogacy Now. These are books which like I think in previous generations would have clearly been seen as like part of feminist theory, but which explicitly kind of distance themselves from being books about gender and trying to kind of like do something else. So I find that really remarkable, and I find it something which I don't have an easy answer to. I don't think there is an easy answer to, because I am someone who's been fascinated with like feminist theory for a long while, but it's very striking that many people, kind of including myself, have felt this fatigue with it, or this sense that obviously there is always a plurality of different feminist perspectives, but like the internal fight between those seems to have become less and less preoccupying for theorists around my age.
Thank you. So I guess one more question before we talk about the book. Is there anything you'd like to add about, in the broadest possible terms, how you see the relationship between the fight for trans liberation on the one hand and the struggle to break with capitalism and start the transition towards a classless and stateless society on the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. A classless and a stateless society. Well, the thing with the, I think with the stateless society, I think a lot of the time, like, transition sort of overlaps with people moving across national contexts, and this happens in a lot of ways, and it definitely includes, but isn't kind of reducible to, the experience of people who become refugees. But very often it seems like displacement or distancing from your original national context is just part of trans life. And in a way, it makes things a lot easier. You know, you defamiliarize yourself with your surroundings, you move to a new city, you move to a new set of people, you reintroduce yourself. And this is something which I write about in a piece I co-wrote with a friend of mine, Nathaniel Dickson, who also has a chapter in the book, by the way, called The Future of Trans Politics. And this is up on the, you can search for it on Google, The Future of Trans Politics, and that will come up. So this question of like a stateless society, I've got a lot to say about nationalism, and like I basically just don't think it's a coincidence that nationalists have become so preoccupied with transition as this perceived threat, this kind of like wandering folk devil, which of course used to appear in an ethnic sense and now has reappeared in a gender sense. In the nationalist kind of imaginary. So that's the kind of stateless aspect. But with the classless thing, I think like I said before, I see these concerns as like in a way it's the same answer we Marxists offer to everything. It's like like the classless society has to be the anything short of a classless society, I don't think really provides a meaningful emancipation. It just, I suppose it diversifies the people sleeping under bridges, or at least, whatever. On the surface, it diversifies the elite workforces, but then this is always only like a sliver of the overall population, right? So yeah, that's that's the relationship. Like we've got to do it. In this piece I was just writing for Missy Mag with Ella Rourke, this is one of the things which I say, which is just like, in a way we can see trans liberation, it's still the means. Like it can never be an end. Like even if we whatever kind of humiliation or defeat we affect on like those who advocate against our rights, like whatever successful campaign we wage against fascists or transphobic feminists or whoever else, this is not really the aim. This is not really the victory which we're going for. It might be like a secondary goal along the way, kind of like a milestone, but yeah, it's not. It's never going to suffice to defeat fascism and nationalism and transphobic feminism and whatever else. Like that's never going to be our end goal. The end goal has to be communism.
All right, so let's talk about the book a little bit. Since, along with Ella O'Rourke, you co-edited Transgender Marxism, which is published by Pluto Press. It's a collection of chapters that came out in early 2021. So could you tell listeners who don't know about this book a little bit about what's in the book and how you came to work on it and what the response to it has been?
Yeah, so Transgender Marxism came out in May, and it is 14 chapters as well as an introduction and an afterword, which are collected from like a pretty broad range of different Marxist theorists who both of us, like myself and Elle, were already in touch with or reached out to, because both of us were of the opinion that there was a tremendous amount of this thinking, and in fact a really remarkable number of breakthroughs and insights which were already kind of underway and which were already constantly being churned out and generated by the people who were in our broader social circles and people who we were in political struggles with, and people who we just kind of we were familiar with mostly from the internet. But the nature of this production, this kind of theoretical production, was that a lot of it was on very ephemeral and very kind of privatized spaces. So people would share things to their social media account and maybe only their friends would see it, or they would share something, share something to their Instagram stories or their Snapchat even, and then of course it would disintegrate within a matter of hours. So we decided there had to be a more kind of lasting and a more kind of hefty anthology of this kind of material. So pretty much everything in the book, with one exception, was like written exclusively for the collection. And yeah, there's like all kinds of different topics, from like workplace struggles and kind of the ethnography of workplace struggles, which like 2 or 3 of the essays are about, through to like psychoanalysis and like the implications of transgender experience for that and how we can make sense of it, to personal accounts of people's experiences living either in the US or in Lancaster in the middle of England. So we've got like a collection of a very broad range of both topics and approaches from all kinds of remarkable transgender Marxists. And that's what the pair of us were hoping to do. And so far the reception of it has been like really good. We've been having a lot of very I've been having a lot of fascinating conversations. I will say things have been a bit slow due to COVID. Like we're planning on going for a tour and stuff. And also people have been very busy. So like not everyone has been able to completely like read the thing cover to cover. But yeah, that's the fun part of an anthology. Like even the people have been kind of seeding different ideas and different discussions from that book out already. So it's been really beautiful to see. And I'm really hoping that it's gonna like continue to like proliferate and really encourage some more blossoming of this type of thinking and this type of organizing as well.
Oh, certainly. I would encourage everybody listening to check it out, and I'll put a link to the book in the show notes. I certainly, when I read it this summer, it was one of the more memorable things I read this summer. And there's a wide range of different kinds of material in the book. So depending on what people are most interested in, they're likely to find something that will really resonate with them. And I guess as we move towards wrapping up, I would just like to ask, since you've already talked about transliberation and its relationship to the struggle for human emancipation, which of course should be the heart of Marxism, is there anything more that you'd like to say about what transgender Marxism, if we think about that as a Marxism grounded in what you and Elle in the introduction to the book called Trans Life as It's Lived, what that brings to Marxism as a project of revolutionary theory and practice in general?
Cool. Well, that's a great question. I suppose this is the dimension which often Marxists get a bit skittish or a bit wary about trans life as it is lived. These kind of like ethical dimensions are very often things which Marxism doesn't really foreground or doesn't play up. And indeed, Marx is quite notable as one of the most influential thinkers in history who never prepared like a moral or an ethical treatise and kind of had an avoidance of discussing these topics. Nevertheless, I feel like when it comes to trans stuff, there's always this kind of like ethical dimension, because ultimately these a transition isn't, in a sense, a coerced choice, right? It's something which you feel compelled to choose, but something which you decide upon in one way or another. And that's kind of the nature of it. But what I am also interested in, I suppose, is that it also makes me think about another topic which has interested me for quite a while, which is that due to historical circumstances, Marxists have this peculiar position of being these kind of systemic thinkers, very often in a context, increasingly often in a context where they are sort of the oddballs and the fringe. And if you identify someone as a communist, I think to most of the wider population, this is quite a remarkable identifier. And this is something which maybe they probably wouldn't know very many other people who describe that way. And like I say, the reasons for that are very historical. Like this was a purposeful mission which various liberal and also conservative, but especially liberal institutions made sure of, with red baiting and reds under the bed and all of that. But the upshot is that both kind of like being transgender and being a communist are these minoritized positions in a way which I think we need to kind of like try and make sense of. And that's kind of like, that's one of the things I was trying to get at. But yeah, wait, there was one more thing I wanted to say. Oh yeah, and that was about this collection. So one thing about the collection is we didn't have very many Canadians. So if there's anyone listening who wants to reach out to me, I don't think we're going to do a Transgender Marxism 2 anytime soon, but I would really, I would really love to be in touch with, it'd be love to be in touch with some more comrades from Canada. I know a few, but quite busy.
And then last question, I guess for many people, anyone who's listening who is clearly committed to transliberation and has no questions about that, but may still have some questions about Marxism and whether, why did transliberation politics need Marxism? What would be your offering there?
Yeah, well, this is an easy one in a way. What I think that Marxism does better than any other revolutionary tradition I'm familiar with, better than anyone I'm familiar with, it has this attention to the interplay of sensuous reality, so the sensual, the immediate features of our life. It has an attention, and it has in a way, it has an affection for our lives as we experience it, and everything from commodities to the reality of what it's like to be part of a workforce, which, like in Capital, Marx describes as reducing the workers are kind of rendered into dead labor. He uses this term Gelater, the German word for like a gelatine paste, and so on. That's what abstract labor is for Marx. It has this kind of attention to our actual like sensuous conditions, without, I think, sacrificing the kind of the supersensual, as Marx says, the kind of like overarching, the abstract, the kind of like the thing which makes these things appear in these recognizable forms across time. So Marx has this attention to like the sensual and the supersensual, and I think like people who followed in that trajectory and developed that thinking have done a really remarkable amount to try and like bring those two things together. And that's like I guess that's what I get from Marxism more than anything else. With that being said, I'm not a very reliable partisan. I love reading anarchist theory. I love reading anti-colonial material, whether it's like vintage or contemporary, all of this stuff. I'm the kind of person who, you know, I wrote these 2 essays about gender abolition, even though I'm not a gender abolitionist. So like, I try and kind of get through all sorts of revolutionary thinking. And I think each revolutionary tradition has its own beautiful features and it's like its own kind of like truth to bring into bear. But that's specifically what I think. That's like why I'm affiliated with this school. That's what I get out of it. So I've really enjoyed this conversation a great deal, and thank you very much to anyone who's listened all the way through as well.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.